What is the best way to return different types of response entity in Spring Boot? Error handling for REST with Spring. This follows the same teaching style as your earlier Spring Boot topic. Introduction. In Spring Boot REST APIs, controllers often need to return different kinds of HTTP responses depending on what happens in the application. For example, an API may return 200 OK when data is found, 201 created when something is created, 400 bad request when input is invalid, 404 not found when a record does not exist, 500 internal server error when something unexpected goes wrong. This is where response entity becomes very useful. A very common requirement in Spring Boot is returning success responses, error responses, custom status codes, custom headers, custom response bodies. Understanding the best way to return different types of response entity is important, because good REST APIs should return clear and meaningful HTTP responses to clients. This topic helps learners understand what response entity is, why it is used in REST APIs, how to return different status codes, how to return success and error responses, how to handle exceptions properly, the best practice for REST error handling in Spring Boot. This is a very practical and important Spring Boot REST concept. What does returning different types of response entity mean? Returning different types of response entity means sending different HTTP responses from your controller based on the result of the request. In simple terms, response entity equals full HTTP response control. It lets you control response body, HTTP status, response headers. Example concept. Request comes in means business logic runs, means controller decides what response to send. For example, valid request means return data with 200 OK. Invalid request means return error message with 400 bad request. Missing record means return error message with 404 not found. So, this topic is really about how to build proper REST responses. Why this is important. REST APIs are used by front-end applications, mobile apps, third-party systems, other back-end services. These clients depend on correct HTTP responses. Example concept. Client sends request means API responds with proper status and body means client knows what happened. Without proper error handling, clients may not understand the failure. Debugging becomes harder. API behavior becomes inconsistent. Front-end developers struggle to handle errors properly. A good REST API should clearly say whether the request succeeded, whether the input was wrong, whether the resource was missing, whether the server failed internally. That is why response entity is so important. What is response entity in Spring Boot? Response entity is a Spring class that represents the entire HTTP response. It contains body, status, code, headers. Example concept. Response entity T equals response body of type T plus HTTP metadata. Simple example. Get mapping, hello. Public response entity string, hello. Return response entity OK, hello world. Body equals hello world. Status, 200 OK. This is more powerful than returning only a raw object or string. Why not just return objects directly? In Spring Boot, you can return an object directly like this. Get mapping / user. Public user get user. Return new user 1L Nahman. Spring will usually return 200 OK automatically. But this approach has limitations because you cannot easily control error status codes, custom headers, different outcomes. Example concept. Direct object return means simple success response only. Response entity means full control over response. So, if your API needs different success and error behaviors, response entity is usually the better choice. Basic example of response entity at getMapping, message, public response entity string, getMessage, return response entity.OK, request successful. Example concept. Controller method means response entity.OK, means HTTP 200 response. This is the simplest use of response entity. Returning different status codes. One main reason to use ResponseEntity is to return different HTTP status codes. Example: get mapping, users part ID, public response entity, get user by ID, path variable long ID. User is user service.find by ID. If user equals null, return response entity. Status HTTPS not found. Body user not found. Return response entity.OK user. Example concept: user found means return 200 OK. User not found means return 404 not found. This is how one controller method can return different responses depending on the result. Returning success and error responses. A common pattern is: return success body for valid cases, return error body for failure cases. Example: post mapping users, public response entity, create user, at request body user. If user.getName is null or user.getName is blank, return response entity bad request, body, name is required. User saved user equals user service.save user. Return response entity.status HTTP status created .body saved user. Example concept: input validation fails means 400 bad request. Valid request means save data means 201 created. This makes the API more meaningful for clients. Why response entity is sometimes used. You may notice examples like public response entity get user by ID long ID. The question means the response body can be of different types. For example, success means user error, means string error, means custom error object. Example concept: one method may return multiple body types depending on success or failure. This is useful, but not always the best long-term design. Is returning different body types the best approach? It works, but in many real applications, returning very different body types can make APIs inconsistent. For example, success returns user error, returns plain string. Another endpoint returns map. Another returns custom JSON. This creates inconsistency. Example concept: inconsistent API response formats means harder for front-end and client applications. A better practice is usually return normal data for success, return a structured error response object for failures. That gives the API a cleaner design. Better approach: use a custom error response object. Instead of returning plain strings for errors, create a standard error response class. Example: public class error response, private string message, private int status, private local datetime timestamp. Public error response, string message, int status, local datetime timestamp. This dot message equals message. This dot status equals status. This timestamp equals timestamp. Public string get message, return message. Public int get status, return status. Public local datetime get timestamp, return timestamp. Now you can return structured error JSON. Example: at get mapping users ID, public response entity question get user by ID, at path variable long ID. User is user service.find by ID. If user equals null, error response error equals new error response, user not found, HTTP status not found, value, local datetime now. Return response entity.status, HTTP status.not found, body. Return response entity.OK, user. Example concept: success means return real data. Failure means return structured error JSON. This is much better than returning raw text messages. Example JSON error response: if the user is not found, the response may look like this. Message: user not found. Status 404. Timestamp 2026-04-17 10:30:00. Example concept: error happens means API returns readable JSON means client can handle it properly. This is more professional and easier for front-end applications to use. Best practice: Use global exception handling. The best way to handle REST errors in Spring Boot is usually not writing error response entity logic inside every controller method. Instead, the best practice is keep controller logic clean, throw exceptions when needed, handle them centrally using @REST controller advice. Example, concept. Controller detects problem means throws exception, means global handler builds response entity. This is cleaner, more scalable, and easier to maintain. What is @REST controller advice? @REST controller advice is used for global exception handling in Spring Boot REST APIs. It allows you to catch exceptions from many controllers in one central place. Example concept. Many controllers means exceptions happen, means one centralized handler returns proper error responses. This avoids repeating the same error handling code again and again. Example using global exception handling. Custom exception. Public class user not found exception extends runtime exception. Public user not found exception string message. Super message. Controller @getMapping users/ID. Public response entity user get user by ID. Path variable long ID. User equals. User service .find by ID. If user equals null, throw new user not found exception. User not found with ID. Return response entity OK user. Global exception handler @REST controller advice. Public class global exception handler @exception handler user not found exception .class. Public response entity error response handle user not found exception X. Error response error equals new error response. X get message https.not found value. Local date time now. Return response entity .status http status.not found .body. Example concept. Controller stays clean means exception is thrown, means global handler returns 404. This is usually the best design. Why global exception handling is better. Advantages. Cleaner controllers. Reusable error handling. Consistent error JSON. Easier maintenance. Easier scaling for large projects. Example concept. Without global handler means each controller repeats error code. With global handler means one place controls error responses. This is why most professional Spring Boot REST APIs use centralized exception handling. Handling validation errors. Validation errors are also common in REST APIs. Example, DTO. Public class, user request. Not blank, message equals name is required. Private string name. @ email, message equals, email must be valid. Private string email. Getters and setters. Controller. Post mapping, users. Public response entity string, create user. @valid, @request body, user request. Return response entity status, https created. Body, user created. If validation fails, Spring throws an exception. You can handle it globally. REST controller advice. Public class, global exception handler. @exception handler, method argument not valid exception .class. Public response entity, map string, handle validation exception. Method argument not valid exception X. Map string, errors, equals new hashmap, x.get binding result, get field errors. For each, error.put, error.get field, error.get default message. Return, response entity, bad request, body errors. Example concept. Invalid request body means validation fails, means global handler returns 400 bad request. This is very common in REST APIs. Common response entity methods. Spring provides convenient methods for common responses. 1. Return 200 OK. Return response entity.OK data. 2. Return 201 created. Return response entity.status https created. Body data. 3. Return 400 bad request. Return response entity bad request. Body error body. Return 404 not found. Return response entity.status https.not found. Body error body. 5. Return 500 internal server error. Return response entity.status https.internal server error. body, error body. Example concept. Response entity gives easy builder-style methods for common HTTP responses. Should you return string, map, or custom object for errors? Technically, all of these are possible. String map, string object, custom error class. But best practice is usually for quick demos, string or map. For real applications, custom error response class. Why? Because custom classes give consistency, readability, strong typing, better API structure. Example concept. Temporary simple API means string may be okay. Production API means structured error object is better. Recommended pattern for real projects. A good real-world pattern is success responses return actual data DTOs. Exceptions are thrown from service controller. At-rest controller advice handles exceptions. All errors return one standard error response structure. Example concept. Success path equals normal response. Failure path equals centralized error response. This is usually the best approach in Spring Boot REST APIs. Example standard error response class. A more complete example. Public class API error response. Private string message. Private int status. Private string error. Private local datetime timestamp. Private string path. Public API error response. String message. Int status. String error. Local datetime timestamp. String path. This message equals message. This status equals status. This error equals error. This timestamp equals timestamp. This path equals path. Public string get message. Return message. Public int get status. Return status. Public string get error. Return error. Public local datetime get timestamp. Return timestamp. Public string get path. Return path. This gives richer error information to API clients. Example with HTTP servlet request, path at rest controller advice, public class global exception handler. At exception handler, user not found exception.class. Public response entity, API error response, handle user not found exception EX. HTTP servlet request. API error response error equals new API error response. X get message. HTTP status not found value. HTTP status not found get reason phrase. Local datetime now. Request.get request URI. Return response entity dot status not found body error. Example concept. Exception happens means handler builds full error details, means client receives structured JSON. This is a strong production style design. What about generic response wrappers? Some teams use a wrapper class for all success responses too. Example. Public class, API response T, private Boolean success, private T data, private string message. Public API response, Boolean success, T data, string message. This success equals success, this data equals data, this message equals message. Public Boolean is success, return success. Public T get data, return data. Public string get message, return message. Then, get mapping users.id, public response entity AP response user, get user by ID. User equals user service.find by ID. Return response entity.ok new AP response.true, user fetched successfully. This is optional. Some teams like it for consistency, while others prefer returning raw DTOs for success and structured objects only for errors. Best way summary. If the question is, what is the best way to return different types of response entity in Spring Boot? The best answer is use response entity when you need control over HTTP status, body, and headers. Return actual domain or DTO objects for successful responses. Do not manually build error responses in every controller. Throw meaningful exceptions. Handle errors centrally using at-rest controller advice. Return a consistent, custom error response. Object for failures. Example concept. Controller handles business success. Global exception handler handles failures. That is usually the cleanest and best REST design. Common beginner mistakes. Here are some common mistakes. Returning plain strings for all errors. Example: return response entity, bad request, body. Something went wrong. This works, but it is not ideal for larger APIs. 2. Mixing too many response formats. Example: one endpoint returns string error, another returns map, another returns custom JSON. This makes the API inconsistent. 3. Writing try-catch in every controller. This creates repetitive and messy code. 4. Returning 200 OK even when there is an error. This is incorrect REST behavior. 5. Not using proper HTTP status codes. Clients depend on correct status handling. Simple example with controller plus exception handler controller, at REST controller, at request mapping, products. At get mapping, WD, public response entity product, get product at path variable long-id. Product equals find product id. If product equals null, dot throw new runtime exception, product not found. Return response entity got OK, product. Private product find product long id. Return null, example only. Exception handler, at REST controller advice, public class global exception handler. At exception handler, runtime exception dot class, public response entity error response, handle runtime exception X. Error response error equals new error response, ex get message, HTTP status not found value. Local datetime dot now. Return response entity dot status, HTTP status not found, body error. Example concept. Normal flow means return product. Failure flow means exception handler returns error response. Advantages of this approach. Advantages include clean controller code, better REST design, proper HTTP status usage, consistent JSON error responses, easier front-end integration, easier debugging and maintenance. Example concept. Centralized response handling means more professional and scalable API design. Challenges. Some challenges include deciding on one standard error format, handling many exception types, mapping business errors to correct HTTP status codes, keeping success and error responses consistent. Example concept. REST error handling is simple at first, but good API design requires consistency. Concepts learned in this topic. By learning this topic, you understand what response entity is, why it is used in Spring Boot REST APIs, how to return different status codes, how to return success and error responses, why response entity ? Is sometimes used, why custom error response objects are better than raw strings, why at REST controller advice is the best practice for error handling, how to design cleaner REST APIs in Spring Boot. This gives you an important practical Spring Boot REST skill. Simple definition. Response entity in Spring Boot. A Spring class used to return a full HTTP response, including body, status code, and headers, especially useful for REST API success and error handling. Final summary. The best way to return different types of response entity in Spring Boot is to use response entity for response control, return normal DTO data objects for successful cases, and handle errors centrally using at-REST controller advice. While response entity can be used when success and error bodies are different, the best real-world approach is usually to keep controllers clean, throw exceptions, and return a consistent custom error response object from a global exception handler. The key idea is success responses should be clear, error responses should be structured, HTTP status codes should be meaningful, exception handling should be centralized. Once you understand this topic, you can build much cleaner and more professional REST APIs in Spring Boot.